The morning Elizabeth Hart tried to have my Corvette towed by weaponizing HOA bylaws, I knew this retirement dream was officially over. Her excuse? She said she was just enforcing community standards. My name is Marcus Webb. The business card in my wallet still says detective, but I turned in my badge 13 months ago after nearly 3 decades with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, the last 8 years in the Financial Crimes and Fraud Division, here in Meadowbrook Estates, a subdivision about 45 minutes outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm just Mark. The quiet guy who keeps his lawn trimmed and minds his own business. That's exactly how I wanted it. After 28 years of interrogation rooms, court testimonies, and bureaucratic nightmares, my wife Rachel and I bought this house for one reason: peace and quiet. The house came with a spacious 2-car garage, a decent backyard with mature oak trees providing shade, and a homeowners association run by a woman whose smile was as warm as a January morning in the mountains. Elizabeth Hart. She presided over the HOA like a monarch over her kingdom, treating every monthly meeting like a royal decree session and every covenant like scripture. I had simple goals for retirement: tend my small vegetable garden on weekends, maybe take up woodworking, and finally restore my father's car. That's where this whole nightmare began. It's a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, Nassau blue with a brilliant white racing stripe down the center. It's not simply an automobile. It's the last physical connection I have to my father. He bought it brand new in the summer of 1967, walking into a Charlotte Chevrolet dealership and paying cash money he'd saved for 3 years, working double shifts at the Cannon Mills textile plant. Every single Sunday afternoon for 40 years, he'd be out in the driveway with a bucket and chamois cloth, polishing that car until the chrome could blind you if you looked at it wrong. When pancreatic cancer took him 3 years ago, 68 years old, gone in 4 months, he left that car to me with a single handwritten instruction in his will: keep her running, son. She's got stories left to tell. I hadn't turned the engine over in 14 months. Work had consumed those final years before retirement. Then came the stress of the move, the settling in, the endless unpacking. The Corvette waited patiently under a soft charcoal gray cover in my garage, like a memory waiting for attention. To me, it represented legacy and continuity. To Elizabeth Hart, it was nothing more than a flagrant violation of Article 7, Section 4, Subsection B of the Meadowbrook Estates Residential Covenant, the prohibition against vehicles deemed non-operational, in visible state of disrepair, or lacking current registration displayed within view of public thoroughfares or neighboring properties. The rule wasn't actually about whether the car ran or not. It was about appearances, about control, about maintaining Elizabeth's very specific vision of suburban perfection, where every lawn was exactly 2 3/4 inches high and every mailbox was regulation black. Our first significant confrontation happened at the neighborhood's annual spring cookout. Elizabeth cornered me near the dessert table while I was reaching for a piece of someone's lemon cake, her ever-present iPad clutched like a shield against her chest. Her son Preston, a soft-handed 34-year-old with thinning hair and the entitled slouch of someone who'd never worked an honest day, stood just behind her right shoulder, his eyes fixed on my garage where the Corvette sat visible through the open door. "Mr. Webb," Elizabeth began, her voice that particular pitch of courtesy that barely masked condescension. "I couldn't help but notice that vehicle of yours has remained in a stationary position for approximately 9 consecutive weeks now. The residential covenants are quite explicit about such situations." I set down my plate and gave her what I hoped was a diplomatic smile. "It's a restoration project, Mrs. Hart. A classic car. These things take time." "A Stingray?" Preston suddenly interjected, his voice cracking slightly with barely contained excitement. 427 cubic inch big block engine, right? The L71 tri-power setup? Factory original? He took an eager step forward. "Those are incredibly rare. The compression ratio on those motors was absolutely..." Elizabeth's perfectly manicured hand shot up abruptly, cutting him off mid-sentence. Preston, please. We're addressing a serious covenant violation here, not facilitating automotive discussions. Her cold, calculating eyes flicked from me to the car and back to my face, and I could see the gears turning behind them. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics or property values. This was about opportunity, about power, about something she wanted. I trust you'll remedy this situation promptly, Mr. Webb. According to covenant procedures, you have 14 days to bring the vehicle into compliance, which means either it becomes operational with current registration visible, or it's removed from the property entirely. She paused, letting that sink in, her smile sharpening. After the 14-day grace period expires, daily fines begin accruing at $75 per day. Documentation and enforcement can be quite persuasive and quite expensive. I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was already cataloging this interaction the way I used to catalog witness statements. Threat established, timeline given, financial pressure applied, classic intimidation playbook. I'll review the covenant language carefully, I said evenly. I'm sure we can work something out. I certainly hope so, Elizabeth replied, her tone suggesting she hoped for exactly the opposite. The covenants exist to protect everyone's property values. I'm sure you understand. She tapped something on her iPad screen with one carefully painted fingernail. 14 days, Mr. Webb. The clock started 3 days ago. Exactly 14 days later, I marked it on my calendar, the notices began appearing, but these weren't official HOA communications delivered through the proper channels as specified in the covenants themselves. No, these were theatrical productions. The first one appeared tucked under my windshield wiper early on a Tuesday morning, heavy premium cardstock with embossed lettering and the HOA logo printed in full color at the top. The alleged violation? Excessive reflective chrome surface creating visual disturbance and light pollution in residential zone. The fine? $50. Payable immediately via a QR code that linked to what appeared to be a personal PayPal account. The notice was signed with an elaborate version of Elizabeth Hart's signature and included ominous language about escalating enforcement procedures and legal action. It was professional looking enough to fool most people, but I'd spent 8 years investigating financial fraud. I knew what legitimate official documents looked like, and this wasn't one. I brought it inside and examined it carefully under my desk lamp. The paper stock was expensive, clearly purchased specifically to look official. But the toner had a slight texture to it, the kind you get from a high-end home printer, not a professional print shop. More importantly, when I logged in to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA official online portal using my resident credentials, there was absolutely no record of any violation, any fine, or any official communication sent to my address. Rachel, who spent 30 years in corporate cybersecurity before her own retirement last year, scanned the QR code with her forensic software. This payment portal isn't registered to the HOA, she said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. It's linked to a personal account. And look at this, the email address associated with the account is ehmeadowbrook at a Gmail address. Not even trying to hide it properly. Amateur hour. I started a new file folder, labeled simply Heart, and placed the notice inside. Something told me it wouldn't be the last. I was right. 3 days later, another notice appeared, this time taped to my front door. Unauthorized vintage vehicle long-term storage in visible location $75. Then another, non-compliance with previous citations $100. Then, creating neighborhood aesthetic disruption, $125. The amounts were escalating, the violations becoming increasingly creative and absurd. None of them appeared in the official HOA system. None of them followed proper notification procedures. They were pure harassment, carefully designed to look legitimate enough to intimidate, while being just informal enough to avoid any real legal liability. But Elizabeth Hart made one critical mistake. She got greedy. She wasn't just targeting me. Mrs. Anderson, the 76-year-old retired piano teacher who lived 2 doors down and had been in the neighborhood for 23 years, knocked on my door one afternoon looking genuinely distressed. She was holding 3 notices similar to mine, threatening her with foreclosure and property liens over a supposed unpaid balance of $37 for late payment of annual assessment fees. The notices demanded immediate payment via the same PayPal QR code. Mrs. Anderson was in tears. She'd already paid her annual assessment 4 months ago. She showed me the canceled check as proof. She'd called the HOA's official office number repeatedly, but no one ever answered, and her voicemails went unreturned. "I'm on a fixed income, Mr. Webb," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't afford these fines they keep threatening me with. But I don't understand what I did wrong. I've always paid everything on time." I assured her these notices were not legitimate and told her not to pay a single cent. I made copies of her documents for my growing file. This wasn't just about my car anymore. This was systematic intimidation of vulnerable residents. This was fraud. And fraud was exactly what I'd spent the last 8 years of my career learning to recognize and dismantle. The harassment continued escalating in increasingly bizarre and invasive ways. One morning, I walked out to get my newspaper and discovered elaborate chalk outlines drawn on my driveway, not just simple tire position markers, but a complete, meticulous outline of the entire Corvette, as if it were a crime scene, complete with numbered evidence markers, directional arrows pointing inward, and the words "Violation Zone" stenciled in bright fluorescent pink spray chalk. Someone had trespassed onto my property in the middle of the night, gotten down on their hands and knees on my concrete driveway, and spent probably an hour creating this elaborate display. It was juvenile, certainly, but it was also deeply disturbing. Someone was watching my house closely enough to know when I'd be asleep. Someone was willing to spend significant time on my property in the darkness. This had crossed from petty annoyance into something that felt genuinely threatening. I got out my steel tape measure, the good one, from my toolbox, calibrated and accurate. City Municipal Code requires vehicles parked on private residential driveways to maintain a minimum clearance of 6 feet from the public sidewalk. My car, measured from the front bumper to the property line, sat at precisely 7 feet and 4 inches. Well, within legal limits. The chalk lines, however, had been deliberately drawn to make it appear as though the car was encroaching over the property line into public right-of-way. I photographed everything from multiple angles with my phone, making sure to include the measuring tape in the shots for scale and proof. I documented the date and time with timestamp photos. Then I carefully washed away the chalk with my garden hose while my neighbor Tony watched from his driveway, walking his basset hound and shaking his head in disgusted disbelief. "She's absolutely out of control, Mark," Tony said. He was a general contractor in his early 50s, built like someone who'd spent his life doing physical labor. "Last year, I swear to God, she tried to fine me $150 because she claimed my garden gnome violated some made-up neighborhood aesthetic uniformity standard, said it was visually incongruous with approved decorative. It was a gnome, for Christ's sake, 6 inches tall. My daughter gave it to me for Father's Day. What did you do?" I asked. "I ignored her completely," Tony replied. "Eventually she gave up and moved on to harassing someone else. But, man, that woman has serious control issues. She treats this place like it's her personal fiefdom, and we're all her subjects." The chalk incident should have been the peak of the absurdity, but then came the drone. It started appearing about a week later, a small consumer-grade quadcopter, black and gray, equipped with a camera. At first, I'd see it hovering near the property line, just barely within legal airspace. But over the following days, it became increasingly bold and invasive. It would hover directly outside our bedroom window at dawn, its camera lens pointed inside. It would buzz low over Rachel while she worked in her vegetable garden, following her movements. It would shadow me when I walked to the mailbox, maintaining a position about 15 feet above and behind me. It was constant, invasive, harassing, and it was driving Rachel absolutely up the wall. This, however, was Rachel's domain. Before her retirement, she'd worked in corporate cybersecurity and digital forensics for a major financial services company, specializing in tracking down sophisticated fraud operations and electronic surveillance. If there was anyone who could identify and track a consumer drone, it was her. She set up one of her old laptops on our kitchen table and went to work. Within 2 days, she'd identified the drone model, isolated its radio frequency signature, and traced its control signal back to its source. DJI Mavic 3 Pro, she announced one afternoon, not even looking up from her screen. Mid-range consumer model, about $1,500. Pretty decent camera for amateur surveillance. And the control signal originates from 142 Oakmont Drive, the Hart residence, specifically from their backyard. The drone is registered with the FAA under Preston Hart's name. I pulled his registration from the public database, and according to my logs, this thing has violated our property airspace and hovered at or near our windows exactly 27 times over the past 11 days. She turned her laptop screen toward me, showing a detailed map with dozens of red flight path lines crisscrossing our property, with concentrated clusters around our bedroom window, Rachel's garden, and my garage. North Carolina is a one-party consent state for recording, she continued. But drone surveillance laws are very specific. Repeatedly flying over private property with recording equipment, especially near windows and living spaces, constitutes harassment and invasion of privacy under state statute. We have more than enough documentation to file criminal charges and a civil harassment lawsuit. It was time for some calculated, completely legal countermoves. I wasn't going to sink to Elizabeth Hart's level of petty harassment, but I absolutely was not going to be a passive victim either. My response had to be methodical, thoroughly documented, and 100% by the book. Everything legal, everything traceable, everything defensible, in court if it came to that. First move. I filed an official police report with the local precinct about the ongoing drone harassment. I brought printed documentation, Rachel's tracking logs, time-stamped photographs showing the drone hovering at our windows, FAA registration information for Preston Hart's device, and a detailed written statement describing the pattern of behavior over nearly 2 weeks. The responding officer who took my report was a young guy named Miller, maybe mid-20s, eager and professional. He knew I was former law enforcement, it's a small community, and word gets around, and he took the complaint seriously. "This is pretty clear-cut harassment, Mr. Webb," Officer Miller said, reviewing the documentation. "Especially with this pattern of behavior near windows. I'll go have a conversation with Mr. Hart today and issue a formal warning. If it continues after that, we can pursue criminal charges for stalking and invasion of privacy." Miller was as good as his word. That same afternoon, he drove to the Hart residence and had what he later described to me as a very direct conversation with Preston about appropriate drone usage and the consequences of continued harassment. He issued an official written warning that went into the record. The warning was crystal clear. Any further drone flights over our property would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. The drone never came back. Score 1 for the good guys. But I wasn't done. Not even close. It was time to deploy Elizabeth Hart's own favorite weapon against her, the covenants. I cleared an entire Saturday afternoon, brewed a large pot of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with the complete, unabridged Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Residential Covenant. Document all 127 pages of dense, single-spaced legal text. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic absurdity, filled with mind-numbingly specific rules about everything imaginable. What color you could paint your mailbox, black or bronze only. What species of grass you could plant in your lawn, Kentucky bluegrass or Bermuda grass. Specifically listed approved cultivars. The maximum height of your backyard fence, 6 feet, measured from grade. The acceptable ranges for exterior house paint colors provided on a separate 40-page chart. Whether you could hang holiday lights, yes, but only between November 15 and January 15, and they had to be white or clear, never colored. It was insane. But buried within this labyrinth of petty regulations, I found exactly what I was looking for. Section 12, Subsection 7, Paragraph C, Landscaping Standards and Native Species Requirements. The language was remarkably specific. All front yard landscape plantings visible from public streets or neighboring properties shall consist exclusively of plant species native to the Piedmont region of North Carolina, as defined by the North Carolina Native Plant Society approved species list, in order to maintain regional ecological character and support local wildlife populations. I pulled up the NC Native Plant Society website and cross-referenced their approved species list. Then I took a walk around the neighborhood with my phone, casually photographing various front yard gardens. Elizabeth Hart's prize-winning, meticulously maintained azalea garden, the stunning display that had won Yard of the Month recognition 4 consecutive times and that she never shut up about at HOA meetings, consisted entirely of kurume hybrid azaleas. Beautiful flowers, certainly. Meticulously maintained, absolutely. But kurume azaleas are rhododendron hybrids originally developed in Japan in the 1800s. They are about as far from native to the North Carolina Piedmont region as you can possibly get. According to the Covenant's own language, which Elizabeth herself had written and championed, her entire front garden was in direct violation. I spent 3 hours preparing a formal, detailed complaint. I didn't submit it anonymously. I put my name right on it. Marcus Webb, 247 Willow Creek Court. I included high-resolution photographs of Elizabeth's azaleas taken from the public sidewalk. I included botanical identification from North Carolina State University's Horticulture Department website, clearly showing the species and their Japanese origin. I included the exact covenant language being violated, with relevant sections highlighted. I included citations to the NC Native Plant Society's official species list, with notation showing that kurume azaleas appeared exactly nowhere on that approved list. And I submitted it all through the HOA's official online complaint portal, the same system that Elizabeth herself insisted everyone use for reporting violations. The complaint was logged, dated, time-stamped, and completely official. Unlike Elizabeth's fake notices, this one was real, documented, and absolutely by the book. 3 weeks and 2 days later, almost exactly the time frame specified in the Covenant's own enforcement procedures, a landscaping company truck arrived at 142 Oakmont Drive. 2 workers got out, consulted a clipboard, and began the process of excavating Elizabeth Hart's award-winning azalea garden. I happened to be outside checking my mail when it started. Elizabeth came running out of her house in her bathrobe, her hair uncombed, absolutely beside herself with rage. Her voice carried across 3 houses. "What are you doing? Stop! Stop immediately! Those are prize-winning plants! Do you have any idea how much those cost? Who authorized this?" One of the landscapers, a patient-looking middle-aged man, held up his clipboard. "We have a work order from the HOA, ma'am. Violation of Section 12, subsection 7, paragraph C. Non-compliant species removal and replacement with approved native plantings. It's all right here in the paperwork. This is absurd," Elizabeth shrieked. "I'm the HOA president. I would know if..." She stopped mid-sentence, apparently realizing exactly what had happened. Her eyes scanned the neighborhood and landed directly on me, standing by my mailbox with my handful of mail and a coffee mug. If looks could kill, I would have been vaporized on the spot. I raised my coffee mug slightly in a friendly neighborly salute. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just acknowledged her gaze calmly and then turned and walked back into my house. The landscapers finished their work. Every single one of Elizabeth's prize azaleas was removed, root ball and all. Per the covenant requirements, they were replaced with native Carolina azaleas rhododendron minus, significantly smaller, less showy, and far less impressive. Her yard of the month garden was gone, replaced with compliant but thoroughly unremarkable native shrubs. I'd used her own weapon against her, perfectly legally, following her own rules to the letter, but I wasn't done yet. I had one more move, and this one was psychological leverage. I ordered a custom car cover for the Corvette, high quality, UV resistant, perfectly fitted to the car's exact dimensions. But this wasn't just any car cover. I had it custom printed with enormous, friendly, impossible to miss letters on both sides. 1967, Corvette Stingray, restoration in progress. Ask me about it. I transformed Elizabeth's supposed symbol of my non-compliance into the most visible, most talked about, most friendly conversation piece in the entire neighborhood. The cover was bright, cheerful, and completely impossible to ignore. And it technically complied with every single covenant requirement. The car was covered, protected from the elements, and the cover itself made it absolutely clear that this was an intentional, ongoing restoration project, not abandonment or neglect. People started stopping by constantly to ask about it. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before would knock on my door or catch me in the driveway, curious about the car, asking about the restoration timeline, sharing their own stories about classic cars they'd owned or their fathers had owned. I'd tell them about my dad, about his 40-year love affair with that Corvette, about the original engine specs, about my plans to have it running again by spring. I showed them old photographs of my father polishing it in our driveway when I was a kid. I was building genuine community goodwill and real human connections with the very neighbors Elizabeth had been trying to weaponize against me. I was turning her attack into my greatest asset. Every conversation, every friendly interaction, every neighbor who smiled and said they couldn't wait to see the finished car, it was all undermining Elizabeth's narrative that I was somehow being a problem resident. The psychological impact on Elizabeth was visible and deeply satisfying. I'd see her driving past my house, slowing down, staring at that bright custom car cover with barely contained fury. At HOA meetings, which I'd started attending regularly, now just to be visibly present, she could barely look in my direction. I'd destroyed her prized garden, turned her harassment campaign into community building, and I'd done it all completely legally, using her own rules against her. But this was all still just suburban theater, annoying for her, satisfying for me, but not dangerous. Not yet. That changed completely on a Tuesday morning in late September when my neighbor Tony came knocking on my door before 7 a.m., looking absolutely panicked. "Mark," he said, his voice tight, "my truck is gone. Just gone." Tony's truck was his entire livelihood. It was a 16-year-old Ford F-250 Super Duty, beat up and rusted around the wheel wells, but mechanically solid, with 240,000 hard-earned miles on the odometer. More importantly, it was his mobile workshop. Every tool he owned was locked in the truck bed under a heavy-duty tonneau cover. Professional-grade power tools, an expensive air compressor, his Milwaukee cordless tool set, scaffolding, ladders, saws, drills, probably $15,000 worth of equipment. He was a general contractor, and that truck was how he made his living, how he fed his family, how he paid his mortgage. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, already pulling on shoes. "I parked it right there at the curb last night. Same place I always park it," Tony said, pointing at an empty space in front of his house. "This morning I came out to head to a job site, and it's just not there. No broken glass, no signs of anything, just gone." We walked over to examine the curb. He was right, no evidence of forced entry, no indication of a struggle or hot wiring. The spot where a 2-ton truck should have been sitting was just empty pavement. It was as if someone had lifted it with a crane and spirited it away in the night. "Did you call the police?" I asked. "First thing," Tony said. "They took a report, said they'd check impound lots and notify surrounding jurisdictions. But Mark, here's the thing. I got a notice from the HOA 2.5 weeks ago about a small oil stain on the street where I park. You know how old trucks are? They drip a little. It was tiny, like the size of a quarter. I cleaned it up the same day with degreaser and cat litter. Got rid of it completely. But the notice said if the issue wasn't permanently remediated, my vehicle could be subject to removal and impound at owner expense per county code enforcement authority." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. That phrase, removal and impound at owner expense, that was very specific language. Too specific. "You still have that notice?" I asked. "Yeah, inside. Want to see it?" I absolutely did. Tony retrieved it from his kitchen, another one of those heavy cardstock, professional-looking notices with the HOA logo. Signed by Elizabeth Hart. Dated September 8th. The language was formal and threatening, with references to county codes and enforcement authority. But when I looked carefully at the supposed county code citation listed at the bottom of the notice, something felt wrong. I pulled out my phone and looked up the actual Mecklenburg County code referenced in the notice. The section number existed, but it dealt with commercial vehicles illegally parking in residential zones overnight. Tony's truck wasn't commercial. It was personally owned, registered in his name, with personal plates. The notice was using real-sounding code language, but it was applying it incorrectly to create a false sense of legal authority. Don't pay anything if they send you a bill, I told Tony, and call me the second you hear anything about the truck. I went home and told Rachel what had happened. She was already pulling up her laptop before I finished the story. If this is what I think it is, she said, Tony's not the first victim. She was right. Rachel spent the next 2 days conducting what she called open source intelligence gathering, completely legal research using public records, county databases, HOA meeting minutes, and online community forums. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 19 months, 11 Meadowbrook residents had reported vehicles disappearing under similar circumstances, all after receiving HOA violation notices about minor issues. 11 vehicles gone. None ever recovered. None ever found in official impound lots. All of them older models, nothing flashy or expensive, but every single one owned outright, with no liens, no bank involvement. And when Rachel dug into the sparse documentation that existed about these mysterious tows, she found a pattern. Every single one. According to scattered references in HOA email threads that Rachel accessed through public records requests, had supposedly been handled by the same company, Apex Roadside Solutions. Apex Roadside Solutions was registered as a business, but barely. Their business address on file was a UPS store mailbox location. Their listed phone number was disconnected. Their website hadn't been updated in over 3 years and contained nothing but a generic stock photo of a tow truck and a form that went nowhere. They had no reviews, no social media presence, no actual evidence of being a functioning business. But buried in the Mecklenburg County business filing records, Rachel found something interesting. Apex Roadside Solutions was listed as a subsidiary of a holding company called Piedmont Asset Management LLC. And when she traced that holding company through another layer of corporate records, she found that it was in turn owned by a much larger regional development firm, Stonebridge Development Group. That name sent a jolt through me. Stonebridge Development was currently building the massive, controversial Phase 5 expansion of Meadowbrook Estates, 200 new houses being constructed on what used to be farmland at the edge of our subdivision. The project had been rushed through county planning approval in record time, despite significant community opposition about traffic, school capacity, and environmental concerns. And Elizabeth Hart, I knew, sat on the County Planning Advisory Board. She'd been one of the most vocal champions of the Stonebridge expansion project, praising it at every HOA meeting as bringing growth and prosperity to our community. The pieces were starting to assemble into a picture, but it was a picture much darker than simple HOA pettiness. This looked like organized fraud, using HOA bylaws as legal cover to systematically steal vehicles from vulnerable residents. The fake violation notices created a paper trail that made the thefts look quasi-legitimate. The victims were carefully selected, older vehicles, owned outright, belonging to people without significant legal resources to fight back. And somewhere in this chain, Elizabeth Hart was involved, connected to a development company that had everything to gain from a fleet of cheap vehicles for their construction project. But we couldn't prove any of it, not yet. Everything we had was circumstantial patterns, suspicious connections, and missing vehicles. No direct evidence, no smoking gun, no way to definitively link Elizabeth or the HOA to actual theft. I needed to talk to someone I trusted, someone who could help me build a real case the right way. I pulled up my phone contacts and found the name I was looking for. Detective Sarah Diaz. Charlotte Mecklenburg PD, Auto Theft Division. Sarah and I had worked together years ago on a major chop shop case, a sophisticated operation running stolen luxury vehicles through fake repair shops and selling them with laundered titles across state lines. She was brilliant, thorough, and she had exactly zero tolerance for criminals who thought they were clever enough to get away with it. I called her cell. She answered on the third ring. Marcus Webb, I heard you'd finally hung up your detective shield. How's retirement treating you? Complicated, I said. Sarah, I need your help with something. I think there's an organized vehicle theft operation running out of my subdivision using HOA violations as cover, and I think it's bigger than just a few stolen trucks. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then tell me everything. We met the next day at a coffee shop halfway between my house and her district headquarters. I brought everything Rachel had compiled, the timeline of disappearances, the documentation of fake HOA notices, the corporate structure connecting Apex Roadside Solutions to Stonebridge Development, Elizabeth Hart's position on the planning board. I laid it all out on the table between us. Sarah listened carefully, taking notes in her small leather notepad. When I finished, she sat back and took a long sip of her coffee. This is solid preliminary intelligence, Marcus. Really good work. But here's our problem. We can't touch it officially yet. Everything you've brought me is circumstantial. We need actual, direct evidence of a crime in progress, a vehicle we can track and trace, a witness willing to testify, something concrete that ties these disappearances to specific individuals. Otherwise, any defense attorney worth their hourly rate will tear apart a circumstantial case in about 15 minutes. What if we could give you that evidence? I asked carefully. What if we could catch them in the act? Sarah raised an eyebrow, studying my face. What are you thinking, Marcus? My Corvette, I said. It's the one thing Elizabeth Hart and her son want most in this entire neighborhood. Preston's been practically drooling over it since the day I moved in. What if we let them try to take it, but we track it, document everything properly, and lead you straight to wherever these vehicles are actually going? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering, you're talking about using your own vehicle, your father's car, as bait in a sting operation. I am. I confirmed. That's risky, Marcus. If anything goes wrong, if they damage it, or if we lose the tracking signal, you could lose that car forever. Are you sure you want to take that chance? I'm sure, I said, but we do this right. Everything legal, everything documented, everything that will hold up in court. Can you work with that? Sarah smiled, a determined, predatory smile I remembered well from our old cases together. Oh, I can absolutely work with that. Let me make some calls. Over the next week and a half, we carefully planned the operation. Detective Diaz brought in two people she trusted completely. Officer Miller, the young patrol officer who'd handled my drone complaint, and a tech specialist from the department's surveillance unit named Jennifer Brooks. Rachel, using her extensive technical expertise, worked directly with Jennifer to install sophisticated tracking equipment in the Corvette. They removed the dashboard carefully over 2 evenings in my garage, installing a GPS tracker no bigger than a matchbox deep inside the instrument cluster, powered directly by the car's electrical system so it would never lose power. The tracker was commercial-grade, police specification equipment capable of real-time tracking with minute-by-minute location updates. They also installed a voice-activated audio recording system behind the radio housing compact, high quality, designed for exactly this kind of operation. Detective Diaz handled all the legal paperwork. I signed explicit written consent as the vehicle's owner, authorizing the installation of tracking and recording equipment for security purposes. The documentation was thorough, notarized, and filed properly. Anyone who stole the car would have zero expectation of privacy in a stolen vehicle, which meant any recordings would be completely admissible in court. We weren't cutting any corners. Everything was by the book. Now we needed to bait the trap. The timing was perfect. The annual Meadowbrook Estates Autumn Gala was scheduled for the following Saturday, the biggest social event of the year, held under a massive rented tent on the community green. The theme this year was Building Our Future Together, and the guest of honor was none other than the CEO of Stonebridge Development, there to present his vision for Phase 5 expansion and accept an award from the HOA for Outstanding Community Partnership. Elizabeth would absolutely be there in her glory. I started a carefully orchestrated rumor campaign designed to reach Elizabeth's ears. I told Tony, knowing full well that he was the neighborhood's most efficient gossip network, that I'd had enough. The constant HOA pressure, the harassment, the stress, it was ruining my retirement. I'd decided to sell the Corvette right after the weekend to avoid any more problems. Just wanted it gone so I could have some peace. I let Tony see me photographing the car from multiple angles with my phone, as if preparing an online marketplace listing. I even went so far as to print out a for sale sign and prop it up inside my garage window where it would be clearly visible from the street. With a phone number listed that actually routed to a burner phone on my desk that I could monitor. The bait was laid. Now it was just a matter of waiting to see if they'd take it. I was betting on Preston's impatience and greed. He'd wanted that car since the moment he'd seen it. And I was betting on Elizabeth's arrogance. She'd want the satisfaction of taking something I valued, of winning, of asserting her control. 3 days before the gala, I made my final move. When I left the house to run errands that afternoon, I very deliberately, very carefully, accidentally left my garage door open approximately 6 inches, just barely enough to see inside if you were looking. And hanging on a magnetic key hook on the wall just inside, perfectly visible in the gap, was what appeared to be a spare key to the Corvette. It was actually a duplicate key we'd had made specifically for this operation, and it was documented. Detective Diaz had the key code, photographs of it, and a chain of custody record. Everything intentional. Everything documented. The garage door being open wasn't an accident, it was an invitation. An opportunity too tempting to resist for someone who desperately wanted that car. The night of the gala, Rachel and I got dressed in our formal wear-me in a suit that felt uncomfortably tight after months of retirement softness, Rachel in an elegant black dress. Detective Diaz called one final time before we left. My team is in position 2 blocks away, in an unmarked van, she said. We've got the GPS tracker active and monitoring, and we're recording everything. The tech works perfectly. We tested it this afternoon. When you get to the gala, act completely normal. If they take the car, you'll never know it until I call you. Just smile, mingle, and let us do our job. Understood, I said. Sarah, thank you for taking this seriously. Thank you for bringing it to me the right way, she replied. Now go have fun at your party and try not to look nervous. Rachel and I drove to the gala in her car, deliberately leaving my house, my garage, with its conveniently open door, and my father's Corvette, vulnerable and exposed. It felt like walking away from everything important, but sometimes you have to risk what matters most to protect what matters more. The Meadowbrook Estates community green had been transformed. The massive white tent covered nearly half an acre, filled with round tables draped in white linens, a small stage with a podium, and a surprisingly decent jazz ensemble playing in the corner. The place was packed. Seemed like every resident in the subdivision had turned out for this thing. Wine was flowing freely, the food was better than expected, and everyone was dressed in their suburban finest. Elizabeth Hart held court at the head table like visiting royalty. She wore a shimmering silver evening gown and what appeared to be actual diamonds at her throat and ears. The CEO of Stonebridge Development sat beside her, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit looking pleased with himself and the world. Gerald Newsom, the HOA treasurer, a nervous, perpetually sweating man in his early 60s, with a comb-over that wasn't fooling anyone, sat on Elizabeth's other side, fidgeting with his water glass and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Preston Hart was notably, conspicuously absent from the head table. His empty chair sat there like a question mark. Rachel and I found seats at a table near the back with Tony and his wife and a few other neighbors I'd gotten to know. We made polite conversation, laughed at appropriate moments, and tried to look like we were having a wonderful time. My phone sat in my jacket pocket like a lead weight, and every few minutes I had to resist the urge to check it. The waiting was absolutely excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour. 67 minutes into the gala, my phone finally buzzed. A text from Detective Diaz. Vehicle is moving. Tracking active. Do not react. Stay at the event. Act completely normal. We have this. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. Under the table, I squeezed Rachel's hand. She squeezed back 3 short pulses. Our signal that she'd seen the message too. We smiled and continued chatting with our table mates as if absolutely nothing was happening, even though my father's car was being stolen at that very moment. For the next 48 agonizing minutes, I watched the GPS tracking dot on my phone discreetly, carefully, holding it low in my lap where no one else could see. The blue dot moved through our subdivision, out onto the main road, heading south toward the Charlotte outskirts. It traveled for miles, eventually leaving the city limits entirely and moving into the more industrial areas near the airport. Then, at 9:36 p.m., the dot stopped moving. It was stationary at a location the map identified as Secure Lock Storage, a large self-storage facility complex in a fairly isolated area with no nearby residential neighborhoods. The dot stayed there, unmoving. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. Detective Diaz. I excused myself from the table, told Rachel I had to take an important call, and stepped outside the tent into the cool night air. "Talk to me, Sarah," I said quietly. "We've got it, Marcus." Her voice was tight with controlled excitement, the sound of a detective who's just caught a big break. "Your Corvette is at Secure Lock Storage Facility, Unit D23. Preston Hart drove it there. Personally, we had visual confirmation the entire way, stayed well back so he never spotted the tail. He met with 2 other individuals at the facility, both men, both with priors for vehicle theft and fencing stolen goods. They opened the storage unit, drove your car inside, and they're still in there right now. We've had surveillance watching the unit for the past 12 minutes. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. What's your next move? We've got units surrounding the facility perimeter, 4 unmarked cars, 8 officers total. We're getting a warrant right now. Judge is signing it as we speak. We'll be executing entry within 30 minutes. We're going to document everything in that unit, arrest everyone on site, and then, and this is important, Marcus, I need you to stay at that gala. Let Elizabeth think everything is going according to plan. Let her think she's won, because in about 90 minutes, we're going to come for her there, publicly, in front of everyone." A cold smile spread across my face. "I can do that." "I figured you could," Sarah said. "Stay on standby. I'll call you when we're moving." I went back inside the tent. Rachel looked at me, eyebrows raised in question. I gave her the smallest nod. She understood immediately. The trap had been sprung. Now we waited for the second act. At 10:47 p.m., Elizabeth Hart stepped up to the microphone at the podium. She was absolutely radiant, glowing with self-satisfaction and triumph. The crowd quieted, giving her their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice amplified through the sound system, "I have a wonderful announcement to share with all of you tonight. Thanks to the generosity of our outstanding partners at Stonebridge Development and the dedicated work of my son Preston, our HOA will be receiving a remarkable donation, a fully restored classic vehicle that will be auctioned off to raise funds for community improvement projects. This is exactly the kind of community cooperation and generosity that makes Meadowbrook Estates such a special place to live." She was beaming her smile, wide and genuine. She actually believed she'd won. She thought she was about to parade my father's car in front of the entire neighborhood as proof of her power, her control, her ability to take whatever she wanted and call it community service. The tent entrance flaps opened on cue. But instead of a 1,967 Corvette Stingray, 5 Charlotte Mecklenburg police officers walked in, led by Detective Sarah Diaz. They were all in full uniform, badges visible, moving with purpose and authority. The jazz ensemble's music cut off mid-note. Conversations died. Everyone turned to stare. Detective Diaz walked directly toward the head table, directly toward Elizabeth Hart, standing at the podium. The room was absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "Elizabeth Hart?" Detective Diaz said, her voice clear and professional and carrying to every corner of the tent. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit grand theft auto, fraud, operating a criminal enterprise, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Elizabeth's face went through a remarkable transformation in the span of about 3 seconds, from triumphant smile to confused shock, to dawning horror, to complete collapse. All color drained from her face. What? No. There must be some mistake. I don't know what you're... There's no mistake, Mrs. Hart, Detective Diaz continued calmly, pulling out her handcuffs. We have your son, Preston, in custody at a storage facility filled with stolen vehicles. He was caught in the act driving a stolen vehicle belonging to Mr. Marcus Webb. She gestured toward me, still sitting calmly at my table. A vehicle equipped with GPS tracking and audio recording equipment. We have documentation of 11 other stolen vehicles processed through the same facility. We have financial records showing regular payments from your HOA accounts to the theft operation, and we have forged HOA violation notices with your signature used to target victims. Turn around, please. The tent erupted. People were standing, pulling out phones, shouting questions, but Elizabeth just stood there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. Officer Miller stepped forward and gently took her arm, turning her around and placing her hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked shut. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the chaos. Gerald Newsom tried to bolt. He literally stood up from the head table and tried to run for a side exit of the tent, but 2 officers were already there waiting. They caught him before he made it 10 feet, tackled him to the ground, and cuffed him while he sputtered incoherent protests about how this was all a misunderstanding and he was just following orders. The Stonebridge Development CEO, on the other hand, sat very still with his hands visible on the table, looking like a man who knew exactly when to lawyer up and shut up. As the officers escorted Elizabeth toward the tent exit, she locked eyes with me across the room. In that moment, I saw absolute hatred, pure fury, and complete comprehension. She knew. She knew I'd set the trap. She knew I'd baited her into taking exactly the one piece of bait she couldn't resist. She knew she'd been completely, thoroughly, systematically outplayed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just held her gaze steadily until the officers led her out into the night, into a waiting patrol car, and out of our neighborhood forever. The aftermath unfolded over the following months like a carefully orchestrated legal process. Everything Detective Diaz had promised came true, and then some. Preston Hart, faced with absolutely overwhelming evidence, GPS tracking showing him driving a stolen vehicle, fingerprints all over the storage unit, video surveillance, audio recordings of him discussing the theft operation with his co-conspirators, took one look at the mountain of evidence and immediately flipped. He cooperated fully, providing detailed testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. He laid out the entire operation in meticulous detail. Elizabeth had started the scheme nearly 2.5 years earlier, partnering with Gerald Newsom, who had access to all the HOA's financial accounts and could move money around without anyone noticing. They'd connected with a small-time vehicle theft crew through some acquaintance of Gerald's 2 brothers with previous convictions who ran a chop shop operation but were looking to expand into more sophisticated, fraud-based theft. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. The HOA would identify targets' older vehicles owned by residents without significant legal resources and issue fake violation notices that looked official enough to intimidate. The theft crew would then tow the vehicles to the storage facility. At SecureLock, they'd swap VIN plates, forge new titles using a professional printing setup, and then either sell the vehicles out of state through fake dealer networks or part them out for components. The profits were split. The theft crew kept 60% for doing the actual risky work. Elizabeth and Gerald split 25% that came back to them as consulting fees, laundered through a series of shell companies, and Preston received 15% directly in cash, plus first pick of any vehicles he personally wanted. The Corvette had been his obsession from the day I'd moved into the neighborhood. He'd been pushing his mother for months to target me, to create an excuse to take it. The gala had been meant to be their ultimate victory, stealing my car and then having me watch as Elizabeth claimed it was a donation and Preston got to keep it. Instead, it became their absolute destruction. Over the following 6 months, investigators working the case recovered documentation and components related to 17 stolen vehicles. 8 were fully recovered, intact, and returned to their owners. The others had already been sold out of state, but victims received full financial restitution from seized assets, including Elizabeth's house, Gerald's retirement accounts, and the entire operating fund of the criminal enterprise. Elizabeth Hart's trial was swift and brutal. The prosecution had everything: GPS data, audio recordings, financial records, testimony from Preston and multiple victims, forged documents with her signature. Her defense attorney tried to claim she'd been manipulated by Gerald Newsom, that she was just a volunteer HOA president who didn't understand what was happening. But the jury listened to audio recordings of Elizabeth explicitly discussing which residents to target based on their perceived vulnerability, and that defense collapsed immediately. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy to commit grand theft auto, fraud, forgery, money laundering. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Elizabeth, who'd spent decades building her image as the perfect suburban queen, would spend the next 12 years in an orange jumpsuit, answering to guards and living in an 8x10 cell. The fall from grace was absolute and complete. Gerald Newsom received 8 years for his role. Preston, in exchange for his cooperation, received 4 years and 10 years of probation following his release. But the legal punishment was almost secondary to the public humiliation and destruction of his reputation. He'd become a cautionary tale. The neighborhood slowly recovered from the trauma and betrayal. A county judge placed the Meadowbrook Estates HOA into temporary receivership while an independent auditor examined every single financial transaction from the previous 5 years. They found thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines and assessments. Every fake fine was refunded. Every fraudulent assessment was reversed. Victims of the vehicle thefts received formal apologies and full compensation from the HOA's insurance policy and remaining legitimate funds. 4 months after Elizabeth's conviction, we held a new HOA election. Real candidates this time, actual neighbors who genuinely cared about community rather than control. Tony threw his hat in the ring and won the presidency by a landslide. His first official act? He proposed eliminating Article 7, Section 4, Subsection B entirely, the oppressive vehicle rule that had started this whole nightmare. The vote was unanimous. The rule was struck from the covenants forever. The neighborhood transformed. Block parties replaced surveillance. Genuine conversations replaced suspicion and fear. People started actually getting to know their neighbors again. Community replaced control. 6 months after the trial concluded, on a beautiful Saturday morning in early May, Rachel and I stood in our garage. The Corvette sat exactly where it had been that night the police had returned it to me completely undamaged after processing it for evidence. They'd even cleaned it and topped off the fluids. On my workbench lay the title, finally ready for the formal transfer of ownership now that all the estate paperwork had cleared probate. Rachel handed me a pen. "It's time. Mark." I looked at my father's signature at the bottom of the title, that familiar handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas notes my entire life, shaky in his final months, but still unmistakably his. For years, I'd avoided finishing this transfer, as if completing it would mean truly saying goodbye forever. But that wasn't what it meant. It meant honoring his memory by protecting what he'd loved. It meant using what he'd given me to help people who needed help. It meant carrying his legacy forward. I signed my name, Marcus Webb. "Now it's officially, legally yours," Rachel said, smiling. I felt a weight I'd been carrying, grief, obligation, unfulfilled promises, lift from my shoulders. I looked at the car, truly mine, now in every legal and emotional sense. "You know what?" I said. "It's time to actually finish this restoration. Let's get this engine running." Rachel grinned and grabbed her work gloves from the bench. "Finally, and you're going to teach me what every single one of these tools does. No more mysterious hand-me-that-thing instructions." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like months. Deal. But be warned, knowing the difference between a torque wrench and a regular wrench is going to take more than one Saturday. I've got time, she said. We've got all the time in the world now. The quiet we'd moved to this neighborhood seeking had finally truly returned. Not an empty quiet born from fear and control, but an earned quiet born from justice and real community. The kind of peace you only get after fighting for it. And if anyone ever wondered what became of Elizabeth Hart's carefully constructed suburban kingdom, the answer was beautifully simple. It became a real neighborhood with real people looking out for each other.